Welcome back to another update of Marcelina, my Reliance 44 sailboat rebuild project. We have an awful lot of ground to cover with the new video, but first a quick recap of what we did in the last video. I finished assembling the rudder, including inserting the steel shaft and support parts, and then I used thickened epoxy to join the two halves together. The rudder was then fiberglassed and painted, and then I recruited some generous relatives to help install it in the boat. Like I said, we've got a lot of ground to cover with this new video, so let's get right to it. So after putting the stuffing box back on the top of the rudder after it was installed with the new packing material, and adding the quadrant to the top of the rudder shaft, that's the bronze piece you see in the foreground, I needed to install a stop to prevent the rudder from turning too far. I opted for a steel plate mounted to a support beam under the deck. Here I'm trying to work upside down and backwards, and in mostly a blind situation because I can't really stick my head down inside the hatch that's in the cockpit that I'm reaching through here. I was able to get the steel piece bolted in place such that it acted as a proper stop. In the end, I ended up getting about 30 degrees of rudder angle in either direction, which should be just about fine since the rudder is actually slightly oversized anyway. The other arm you see in the video just below the quadrant also attaches to the rudder, and that's the autopilot, which uses an electronic actuator hooked up to a flux gate compass. The next project was to install a couple of winches for handling the main sheet. I had one number 20 Barlow winch that came with the boat and bought two more from a local guy on eBay. Unfortunately, the winches I bought didn't have the base plates, so I ended up buying some 1/4-inch stainless steel and having the plate laser cut. But that only accounts for 2 of the 5 circular parts in the drawing, you say. Well, you're right. 2 more of the round circular parts are backing plates for the 2 purchased winches, which accounts for the parts with the holes in them. And the 5th part, without any holes in it, is a backing plate for the winch that I already had that came with the boat. I didn't pre-cut the holes in the last piece because it's much better to physically match it up with the winch plate to make sure that the alignment is good before drilling the holes. Here you can see the 2 purchased winches in the background without the base plates, while I struggled to free up some parts corroded together on the original winch. It took me about a week of soaking and prying to get this thing loose. I was starting to think that it was all one part. I would soak it in WD-40 for a couple of days and then head off on a business trip and then come back, and then I'd pry and twist and heat it up and whack it, and then I'd soak it again and repeat. Finally it gave up and came loose. Then I installed the original winch first. I'm using butyl sealant around the holes. I'm not concerned about sealing the core inside the holes because this section of the deck is replaced with a plastic coring material, and it doesn't matter if it gets wet, and it won't migrate along the core the way balsa would. The backing plate is probably overkill. Better too strong than too weak. And this is the base plate that the other winches didn't have. I'm only mounting one of the 2 purchased winches right now, but in addition to the 6 holes that mounted to the deck, I need to drill and tap 3 other holes to secure the winch to the plate. The stainless steel is really hard on drill bits, but fortunately I had some cobalt bits left over from a project at home. So the base plate and backing plates are secured to the deck, and then I used nuts to create a standoff between the winch and the base to allow for clearance of some of the winch parts. Then I just screw the mechanism into the base plate and slide on the drum. Voila! Except now there's a gap from the bottom of the drum to the deck. So I took a section of the old floor and made a little wooden collar. A few coats of varnish, and this becomes this. And the best part is that it fits nice and snug, so I don't need to glue or screw it down. Of course, this modification required another modification. The hatch cover now interfered with the new wooden winch collar. So, a little more cutting and varnishing, and all was good. While I was at it, I put on a new lock on the hatch cover and added recessed and lockable latches to the lazarette covers in the cockpit. I also installed a couple of clutches that feed line to the winches. I'll be using what's called a German-style mainsheet system. This has two separate sheets led to the boom from either side of the coach roof. So I'll have a clutch and a winch for each sheet. This is the simplest way to control the boom, although it's not very common. Originally, there was a traveler which spanned across the cockpit seats, which I really didn't like. If I had a traveler on the coach roof, it would require a bridge to span the hatch cover, which is expensive. So we'll see how this two-sheet system goes. If it's a pain, I'll just bite the bullet and get the bridge traveler. Another upgrade was to replace the old stuffing box for the drive shaft with a dripless shaft seal. Even getting the camera to the spot to film the seal is difficult, let alone reaching in there to install it. There's a bellows that covers the shaft tube that exits out of the boat, and then a steel collar that butts up against the bellow. The steel collar mounts to the shaft and then is secured to it. The vertical hose fitting you see here is just for a hose to run above the water line because the water is coming in through the shaft tube and lubricates the seal between the bellows and the collar on the shaft. Then I tackled replacing the scupper hoses that drain the water from the cockpit. The through hulls are plastic, which I don't care for, but they're in good shape, so I'll keep them. The first thing I noticed, however, was that there were multiple splices in the line and only single hose clamps anywhere there was a connection. It's always good practice to double up on the hose clamps anywhere below the water line. Then I discovered this. What you're looking at is the scupper plumbing on the port side. The cockpit drain is here, which comes down to a T. Okay, but there's a second T here that has no function, at least that I could tell, except to add extra points of failure. But up from the T, the hose seems to be just bent over at the top. What's up with that? And just for reference, the water line is about here. So anything that fails below that line will convert this boat into a submarine. So yeah, multiple unnecessary points of failure, single clamps, and mystery hoses. This thing's coming out. And what do I find? Well, first, that bent over hose is filled with epoxy. But amazingly, the upper section is just stuck in with the remnants of maybe some silicone. Honestly, this is just inexcusable. Making a hose connection below the water line like this puts the boat and, more importantly, the crew in serious danger. It's hard to see here, but to make the scupper drains as safe as possible, I used a single hose with a 90-degree elbow with doubled hose clamps on either side. Okay, out of the bowels of the boat and over to the rigging. I was inspecting the roller furler, and I found that the black piece that kind of looks like a hockey puck near the end of the furler was not inside the corresponding spot in the drum. The drum acts as a kind of bearing race for the hockey puck as the drum turns. But the drain was just sitting on top of the puck, meaning the drum had lots of slop and would not turn properly. There was some wear on top of the drum, so it must have been like this for quite some time. Anyway, I used some silicone grease to lubricate the puck and put everything back together correctly. And I have to say, my wife is very smart and very helpful. She found a neighbor to do the cabinet work inside the boat. His name is Mike, and he's already started correcting past mistakes and roughing some stuff in. Much of this is temporary to check the fit, but I'm really pleased with what he's done. Also, I inadvertently threw away the nut for the prop when I got it back from reconditioning. So I had to have one special made in Germany. Once I had that, I could reinstall the prop. Oh, and I've painted the boat. No, not gray, that's just the primer coat, which is then sanded down smooth. The real color is red. This is the first of 3 coats. In this case, I put the paint on much too thick, and I needed to sand a bit more aggressively than I would have needed to just to scuff up the paint for the next coat. I also failed to clean the roller properly before starting, a lesson that I learned from doing the deck, but which I obviously unlearned somewhere along the line. The result was lots of little fibers in the paint, which needed to be sanded down. For the second and third coats, I switched to a much finer foam roller and got much better results. But, thinking I was clever, I switched to horizontal tipping for the second coat. That was a mistake, because I couldn't blend the horizontal sections properly. But the foam roller worked great. So I kept the foam roller for the third coat and went back to vertical tipping. And the final results look pretty good. Well, final for applying the paint anyway. The next step is to wet sand it to get rid of all of the orange peel and unevenness in the paint, and then buff it down to get rid of the sanding swirl marks, and finally to polish to give it a nice gleaming finish. I'm in the process of doing that right now. As this video is being posted, I'm still in the process of wet sanding, buffing, and polishing my way around the boat. I'm really liking what I see so far, and I think the final product will look great. And then, next time, hopefully in just a couple of weeks, the boat's going to be launched into the water. The interior won't be finished yet, but we can do that after it's in the water and sitting at the dock. I'm really excited about getting the boat in the water, getting the masts up, connecting all the rigging, making sure everything works properly. Oh, and the other thing I need to do is make sure the engine works. I did put some diesel into the tank, and I had a leak in the diesel fuel system. So that's something I need to correct so that the engine will run and I can move it into the slip once it's launched. Anyway, that should be exciting, and I'll have another video just of the launch itself coming up in just a couple of weeks. Please leave your comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon. Bye.